This episode of The Clear Out was recorded on the 20th of February 2024 at home in Wicklow. And it is an episode that jumps around quite a bit, but I go on a journey from critics being silenced in Russia to talking about AI image making and video making and why I don't like it, to an interesting book about hunting sharks, to my desire for simplicity and humility and honesty, and how theatres and karate training halls and churches all sort of cross over with a similar offering, if you like, in terms of places of practice and places of humility and openness. They are empty spaces. So I talk about the implications of that in different ways, both positive and negative. And as usual, there are a few different references scattered about the place, a few movie references here and there. But that's about it. So it's it's simplicity, it's human experience, it's resistance to certain aspects of technology and modernity, and it's all packaged into an hour and 10 minutes about. Okay, so I hope you can handle that. If that sounds like your thing, I will see you around the corner. Cheers.
Not gonna change my mind, leaving the dream behind, keep my moji inside.
Hi, my name is Dara Clear and you're listening to The Clear Out. You're very welcome. I hope this moment finds you well. How's everything been going? How's your day? How's the week been? How's this moment in time? How's it treating you? How are you spinning in the universe? That's often how it's often how I think of myself. Not from this mad egotistical point of view, quite the opposite. Just as this molecular speck in a universe of endless, countless, infinitesimal sort of organisms which are utterly anonymous, and yet each one is simply trying to survive. Each one is travelling through the universe by itself somehow, even when it might come into contact with others, even when it might travel its journey with others. Ultimately, the organism is on its own. It's a solo flight. It's a solo capsule, a solo pod, if you will. And that's the journey that everyone is on. And alliances, relationships, moments of togetherness, of unification, of love, of hatred, of violence, of connection, of generation, of procreation. It's merely coincidence. That's all. Just lucky. Random. I mean, I did do an episode on this concept more or less last year. Something about blips on the grid. We're just blips on the grid of life, this vast matrix of organic interaction. The organism alone. And that's, I don't consider that a negative frame. I consider it a fact of life. And in fact, I often find it quite heartening to remind myself of that. And sure, it's sort of analogous or adjacent to perhaps a misguided notion of free will. Every time I bump into a neuroscientist in the online space, they're all like, free will is a myth. You have no agency at all. I mean, I'm paraphrasing brutally, but it sort of makes me laugh that I'm stubbornly going, no, I do have free will. I'm making so many choices on a daily basis, and they'll argue, no, you're not. Something else is happening, predetermined on some level. But I entertain myself with that delusion that I am the master of my ship. I am the pilot, the sailor, the captain. I am at the helm. So that was my question to you. How's your journey? How's your journey through the universe going? Do you feel you're managing okay? Do you have provisions? Are you going to run out of fuel? Do you like what you see outside the window of your spacecraft? What do you see? Does it fill you with joy? Does it fill you with dread? Are you inspired? Are you disheartened? Is your cynicism in humanity in particular confirmed regularly? Or can you see those moments of grace that lift you and move you and motivate you? Because movement is motivation, isn't it? To be motivated to action, to be inspired, to take in breath, to take in life. I can't speak for you. I can only speak for myself. And some days are better than others. What can I tell you? The weather report, because I know you're dying to know what's happening here at #blessed. It's just stopped. Oh no, it's still drizzling a bit. It was dryish earlier. I had a swim. It was cold, but not too cold. My body, for whatever reason, seems to be handling the cold water pretty well this winter. Well, spring now. But considering I haven't been in that much, I'm not having palpitations or a serious after drop in temperature on the other side of the swim. So it was good today. I was quite tired when I was facing the sea. I was just doing a bit of scrolling on my phone before getting into the water. A little bit of chop, a few waves kind of rolling in, but nothing too serious. But I knew it would be a good circuit breaker, as it always is. Just like almost like a defibrillator, just giving you that jump start, bang, okay. And it just kicks the headspace into a different place. And yes, go and listen to last week's episode where I talked about that article on the vagus nerve, which a guy from my football game, had written an article about. I don't think I put a link to that. Maybe I'll do that this week. Anyway, there you go. So let's get into what has to be got into in this week's episode. A few different things. I've been thinking about AI, and I've also been thinking about Alexei Navalny, the high-profile and dedicated critic of Vladimir Putin and his regime, and his passing last week. I've been thinking about other things as well. There might be time to talk about a couple of movies watched recently, but maybe not. I might save those for another day. I'll just see how things are going. So, where to begin is my question. Maybe just a brief reflection on Alexei Navalny and his alleged murder at the hands of the Putin regime, the Putin government. There's been, as far as I can tell, across the media that I consume, which is generally left or liberal leaning, there's been very outspoken criticism, and I guess I'm not sure if I've saw anything that qualified as outright condemnation, but definitely a clear critical stance of Alexei Navalny's end. His wife, is it Julia Navalny, it looks like she's going to kind of take up his cause and continue to protest against the injustices and the sort of repression of Putin's Russia. But I must say, like when the news broke, I did have that sort of emotional reaction of just feeling sort of sickened, I suppose, because it just seems from afar to view that it just looks very blatant and obvious, and you just sort of, it's very easy to feel you're deducing the facts very clearly, that here's someone who's been targeted by Putin, poisoned, imprisoned, and finally killed, dying in custody, in sketchy circumstances, under a very unapologetic regime. And why was I sickened? Because it feels wrong. Because it feels like something that represents liberty. Is that it? Alexei Navalny, what did he represent? Moral courage, speaking against a very dangerous institution in terms of Putin's government, Putin's regime, knowing that the cost could be dire, speaking truth to power. These are things I respect. There's generally a frustrating and disappointing absence of those voices across the political world. Governments that are enthralled to private sector influence, enthralled to more powerful interests, more powerful governments, enthralled to the power of money, of corporate investment. Yes, I am talking about the Irish government here, amongst others. So when you see someone who is, and I can't speak to Alexei Navalny's emotional state, if he spoke with fear or without fear, but he certainly spoke in spite of fear, if he was afraid. And yeah, it's just it just feels like that's an element of good, or an element of righteousness that has just been removed from the map. And Putin continues to smirk. And I don't have a particularly anti-Putin agenda, but that sort of what seems to be blatant silencing of critics is not something I value, and obviously it makes it harder for anyone else to be outspoken. And if that's a sort of a hallmark of totalitarian regimes, and certainly to look back at sort of communist communist governments and communist institutions and regimes from sort of mid 20th century on, and their relationship to censorship and control of the message, and the way people were disappeared or had to leave or ended up in gulags or prisons. And you would think of countries like Russia and China in particular, perhaps. I mean, the USSR, I suppose, across the USSR, and how the rhetoric and the public and international agenda of communism and Cold War communism was preserved, and it was preserved in very uncompromising circumstances, with secret police and all the rest, all these kind of instruments of repression and control. Now, of course, the lie we tell ourselves in the West is that Western governments don't do that. And I'm not going to sit here now and start getting into dodgy behaviour of Western governments. This really was, because it's like, that's not really my focus ever, is it? But it's important that, well, I think it's important that you retain a critical head and kind of go, hold on, it's never a binary. These guys are good, these guys are bad, and we're living in a time of great intellectual impoverishment in general public discourse, and certainly in the discourses that happen online and across social media. There's such extreme binary thinking and such extreme sort of valorizing of subjectivity and the subjective experience, and the desire to cancel people and deplatform people. I just don't value any of that. I don't think it helps anyone. I don't think it edifies anyone. I mean, I suppose arguably the people who are doing the cancelling, they feel it helps them, but as I've said before, that stuff is, it runs very close to fascism. It's so intolerant. But in any case, to go back to Putin, like all this sort of outrage in the West and the kind of online activism, I just find myself thinking, what does he care about that at all? Do you think he's worried? Do you think Putin is going, oh no, there's an online campaign, an online petition to express, outrage at what's been done here. I'm in danger. I don't think he feels in danger at all. I don't think he cares about liberal hand-wringing and pearl clutching. I don't think he cares about what's printed in Western, progressive media. I just ask myself, where's the incentive for him to stop doing what he's doing? Because this is strongman leadership, strongman politics. And again, not being any student of Russian culture or Russian history, but certain things I feel I've intuited or understood or read or heard. I think a lot of people in Russia like that type of leadership. They value the strong man model. But again, I'm not sitting here with any data, any research, any stats under my fingertips, so I'm not sure what level of popularity Putin actually enjoys. But I suspect the Russian populace is extremely cynical, and I wonder how many tears they're shedding for Alexei Navalny, outside his specific, followers or supporters or advocates. So I don't know what the conclusion is there. I mean, what the conclusion is, what incentivizes that type of leader to refrain from silencing critics? I mean, when you reduce that to, basic psychology, I mean, my argument always is it's the desire to silence critics is fundamentally a very fearful position and a very insecure, it's a very insecure need. If you feel I cannot tolerate criticism, I cannot tolerate the presence of criticism. I remember working in different schools in Melbourne, and routinely in different schools, particularly if you're a new teacher, as I was in some cases to those schools, management would request that you allow yourself be observed teaching, and I never had any issue with it. I just thought, yeah, do what you have to do, and I just trust that I would represent myself well and represent my teaching well, and I didn't particularly modify anything or change what I was doing. I just taught as I always taught. But there were teachers who refused to let that happen. There were teachers who refused management, or whatever, representatives of management to come in and observe. And it doesn't speak to confidence. It doesn't speak to transparency or faith that what I'm doing is good and I'm not afraid for people to see this. And I received criticism, but I benefited. I could look at it, the first time I was observed, I could look and go, yeah, you know what, that wasn't great. I wasn't really, I didn't bring my A game that day. And I was observed subsequently by the same person not that long after that, and it was a different experience for both of us. So, and that, for the better. So, yeah, like I just think the idea that you want to shut out all negative voices. I mean, if we draw a line to the type of wellness that I'm often critical of, where there can be no dark things, no bad elements in what I'm presenting here, and I just, again, for the umpteenth time, I really distrust that position. And obviously what I try to do here when I'm talking about things like emotional and psychological well-being, when I'm talking about mental health, I try to walk that line very honestly, openly, authentically, and that's why I can do an episode like I did a few episodes ago and really go deep on my own struggles with depression, and how suicidal ideation is part of that experience for me. And I'm just trying to walk the walk, and I don't feel ashamed of that. I think it's useful to talk about it. And again, that's it. In a way, it's sort of going, well, look, you can't criticize me for not being honest. You can't criticize me for trying to only present one thing, and you can't criticize me for just trying to present some sort of constantly upbeat, happy, jolly, blissed out, wellness babbling moron. I mean, maybe I come across like that occasionally. I mean, in a way, I hope I do occasionally, because that's a nice counterpoint to going into the dark corners, and that's as it should be, because we humans. I speak for the human race. We're complex and messy and many layered and many faceted, and we can't be reduced to this or that. So yeah. Anyway, look. I don't know what you draw from that reflection. I think it's a shame. I think it's very sad that Navalny, as a critic of a repressive totalitarian government like Putin's, that he's gone. That's not a good thing. So, there has to be balance. Has to be. Is that an ideal Is that an ideal aspiration? But balance, there has to be balance in the world. You have to balance the bad with the good. If you're going to use those kind of terms, if you're going to step into the binary, balance the darkness with the light. And I really, on a personal wellness level, I believe in that idea. I believe in the idea of how we walk through life. Again, let's go back to the image at the start of the podcast, the idea of traveling through the universe alone. What do you bring with you as you move into each new space, as you move into each new moment? What are you bringing? What's your contribution to the larger energy of the universe? I mean, do you ever think about that? Do you ever think about what your own personal sphere of energy is like? I think my own personal aspiration is to be a sort of a balancing element. I think, and again, I'm sure I've spoken about this before on the podcast, but to be a balancing element in the world, something that sort of brings things back to an even keel. So it's about being thoughtful, it's about being reasonable, it's about being calm, it's about trying to not be hysterical and jump on the various bandwagons and just impulsively rah 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 with everybody else. It's just to be a bit more considered, and to sort of it's to occupy your own space rather than occupying the spaces of others. How about that? So it's fundamentally a very anti-colonialist idea. Occupy your own space. Don't occupy the space of others. That's really it. And are we happy to do that? Or are we always sticking our oar in elsewhere? Are we always trying to be something else? Are many of us afraid to occupy our own space because we don't like what dwells there? And just to spell that out, you dwell in your own space. So, anyway, there you go. Okay, not directly connected at all, and maybe not even indirectly connected, maybe just not connected, but I'll see if I can at the end, if there's a connection to be made. I said I want to talk about AI. So I don't know how you're getting on with the ever more obvious presence of AI in our lives. If I use the word intrusion, that's a very kind of prejudicial word. But encroachment, is that less loaded, less slanted? AI is, it's coming. AI is here, and I guess it's been here for a while in less visible ways, and maybe that makes those ways more benign or more sinister, depending on how you think about them. But certainly AI in the hands of creatives and artistic people and social media users, AI is becoming more and more visible, more and more there. A friend of mine, hi Tim, if you're listening, a friend of mine sent me a link to somebody's Twitter account where he was, I don't know how long the list was it 12? Was it 50? Just different examples of AI video making, AI film making, and the related prompts that produced the AI clip. And I looked at the first one, and it was a woman walking through maybe Tokyo at night on a wet street, and all the neon lights and the reflected images in the water on the street, and a very stylish, matrixy looking woman, and all very cool and perfect. And was it sort of video real? I think it was, in terms of the quality. Could I have been looking at a video? I think I felt I could have. The next one, I think the second on the list, was 3 or 4 or 5 woolly mammoths moving towards the camera, towards the screen, across snow, and billowing clouds of snow being displaced as they moved closer. And that was it. I had to turn it off. Because I'm not going to sit here and look at all these. And I had a sort of a visceral reaction to seeing those images, in terms of my sense of repulsion. Which sounds quite strong, doesn't it? But in terms of my sense of like repulsion, my sense of resistance, my sense of invasiveness by this tech, and the ease with which people can create beguiling images to draw us in, seduce us, captivate us, and I'm sure ultimately, to sell us something. But I just felt I want to step away from my phone and get away from this. And what occurred to me was that there was a stage in computer generated imagery. There was a stage when that technology was still very far from perfect. And I can't remember when Steven Spielberg did his motion capture version of Tintin, featuring actors like, was it Jamie Bell playing Tintin, and was it Daniel Craig playing Captain Haddock? And though I didn't particularly enjoy the film, there was something just very dead about it. And what's the other one that comes to mind? The Polar Express with Tom Hanks, again motion capture, and that was a bit earlier. The tech was even less good, more imperfect. Now if you go back and even look at a few clips from those two films online, just put in Spielberg Tintin movie and the Polar Express, and they are portraying, now Tintin's portraying cartoon characters, like they're from the Belgian comic book series, by Hergé, which I loved as a kid. I've even read reread a few of them in the last year or so, just as a just a little kind of a happy sort of indulgence. And they generally don't captivate the way they would have as a child. But the movie that Spielberg did, those characters, they just didn't quite work. There's just something that the human eye resists, something that the human eye recognizes as this is neither it's neither fish nor fowl. It's neither fish nor fowl. Neither fish nor fowl. There's something unnatural that the human brain and the human eye goes, wrong. This is making me feel a bit uneasy in its wrongness, and it just doesn't fit into an area of understanding and allocation or categorization where I can go, oh yeah, okay, that's what that is, that makes sense, I see it, I accept it, I can now discard it and just enjoy the story. No, there was no discarding. It was just like every time you looked at those characters, it was like, and it's even worse in the Polar Express, that I want to say was directed by Robert Zemeckis. Is that right? You can check that. Even worse. Just these very odd characters. To a lesser extent, if you look at the king in the first Shrek movie, voiced by John Lithgow. A little bit of that as well. Just a little bit disjointed, a little bit staccato, just not quite fluid enough. And you can sort of, it's easy to sort of visualize the computer graphics behind what we're actually being presented with on screen. So that was that. That was just that stage of CGI, and those movies probably spanned, from Shrek and Polar Express, which were probably a similar enough time, to the Tintin movie. That would have been 10 or 15 years, maybe a bit more. But suddenly we've got this jump. Now, I'm not sure, in terms of the sort of the computer technology behind AI, or the image generation technology behind AI, if that can be now used in, by animators and computer animators, and the likes of the software or digital animators at the big animation companies like Pixar or Disney or Illumination or whatever. But that, what I was just describing, that experience of looking at something and going, this just is wrong, and my brain can't place it in a universe of understanding or comprehension or acceptance. It's close to being something that should be easy to identify and recognize, but it's just the wrong side of being able to accept it. And that's, people refer to that as the uncanny valley. So it's in that sort of in-between space where it's almost, oh yeah, but it never quite is. So it remains in, oh God. So yeah, the difference between oh yeah and oh God. One's acceptance, one is rejection. And that's the uncanny valley. Now, the AI images, those two I described to you at the start of this section, there is not a hint of uncanny valleyness. Nothing. Not a stutter, not a glimmer, not a single off note. It is quite simply disgusting perfection. Now that's a point of view. That's my point of view. This is perhaps what music lovers resisted when CDs first emerged, which was, of course, a form of digital capture, and how people missed the analog experience of listening to music. And certainly it's what people resist when they talk about, the compression of tracks and of music on MP3s, where something is lost. And yet that music is still the product of humans. That music is not the product of a program. And so we can still connect with it and relate to it that way. What I found looking at those images the other day was I was going, there's no human touch on this. So I'm not marveling at the art. I'm not marveling at the ingenuity. I'm not marveling at the creativity. I'm not in awe of the colours that were chosen and how they were applied. I'm not in awe of the craftsmanship. And quite the contrary, I'm going, this is just cookie cutter. Because anybody using the same prompts, and if you haven't experimented with AI, if you haven't used it, when you haven't experimented with AI image creation, that's fundamentally how it works. You use an AI program, software program, which connects you to a particular website, and then you just, type in the prompt. A man walking down a street at night, it's raining, he looks like Humphrey Bogart, his collar's up, his hat is on, a fire rages in the background. And then the AI program will present you with 4 or 5 images to see a selection of what that prompt has responded to. And then you can modify and go in the style of Edward Hopper, or in the style of a classic Hollywood 40s movie, black and white, or sepia, or whatever. And it goes again. So you can keep modifying your prompt. So anyone with the same prompt using the same software anywhere in the world can produce exactly the same image. That's my assumption. I presume that would be the result. And I am not resisting this from an anti-technology point of view. I'm not resisting it from an anti-progress point of view. I'm sort of resisting this from what? What is it exactly that I'm resisting in this? I'm resisting it as another symptom of the disconnect between humans, another symptom of the fracturing and individuation of the modern world, of this moment in history, this moment in life, where so many people feel disconnected, and where so many people feel fractured and siloed away and all at sea, and in dire need of community and of connection and of something tangible, touchable, tasteable, smellable, something that is there for the human senses to verify in the flesh. And AI and AI images are not that. They have no human vibration. And that is what I resist. Because human vibration is where it's at. And when you look at a piece of art, or you pick up a book, or you listen to music, or you watch a movie or a show, or you see a dance performance, or whatever it might be, what you're tapping into and responding to often is human vibration. The human animal that created, the human animal that is moving in front of you, the human energy that is animating or has animated what you hold in your hands, what you see with your eyes. And AI is not that. AI images are not that. They are cookie cutter baubles. And I haven't even spoken about the fact that what they're going to be doing fundamentally is cutting artists and creatives out of the picture. And I looked at an AI program last year as part of the What Does He Need project, the community arts project that is exploring masculinity and the journey from boyhood to manhood in groups of young men in different parts of Ireland. And I've worked with 2 different youth groups on that, and the play I did last year, Manifest, was an iteration of that program. And towards the end of last year, I was trying to work on coming up with images connected to the work I was doing with a group of young men up in Poppintree in Ballymun in Dublin. And I just had a dabble with AI image making, and I was given an image. That I was like, okay, that's really cool and shiny and perfect. And I didn't bring it in to show the young men I'm working with, because my instinct was that they would have been unable to unsee it, and they would have been unable to not embrace it and go, that's what we've been working on. That's the young man that we've imagined in our work, and the young man that we've created in our work. And I didn't want to take that risk. I didn't want to take that chance. And I just decided, no, I'm just getting rid of this. I'm not going to use it. It doesn't feel right. The work that I was doing, and hopefully will continue doing with those young men, is so organic. It's so sort of hard fought for. It's so honest. It's so integral to who these young men are. It's such a product of their experience and their internal lives, that to show an AI generated image as being connected to that would be completely, it would be a betrayal of the work that we've been doing in the room. And I just thought, no, it was the wrong instinct. I was curious to see and thought maybe this will open up my own imagination, but it just sort of confirmed some of my instincts, that no, this is not the way to go. And that's that was my position, and that continues to be my position. And it was funny at the weekend when, and I said it a moment ago, that I had this desire then to just put the phone down, walk away from the phone, and I picked up a book. And it was a book I was given for my birthday by a friend. It's called Shark Drunk by Morten Struxness. That's STRO, and one of those Scandinavian O's with a diagonal slash through it. KSNES, Morten Struxness. And I only read the first few pages, and it was instantly an immersion in something that calmed me down. And it was this journalist from, now I want to say Norway, I hope I'm right, I might not be right, I think I'm right, basically talking about the history of sort of seafaring in his family, and how he was going to travel across to some fractured islands off the coast of Norway up near the Arctic Circle, and travel out onto the icy seas with a friend, this sort of taciturn fisherman who was also an artist, to, I think, hunt a shark. And had to wait for perfect conditions, because otherwise it wouldn't be safe to go out there. But just those first few pages, and the way he described his family history, and the way he described the landscape, and the way he described his fisherman, and the way he described his fisherman's boat, and the kind of climactic conditions, all of it just brought me back down to something real, and it calmed me, and it just felt like the perfect antidote to 30 seconds of looking at AI images. And I was like, this is where I want to be. This is what I want to be in the presence of. And what it pointed out to me in that moment was my desire for simplicity and my desire for honesty. And by saying that, there's an implied indictment of AI as being not those things, because they lack a legitimacy, and they lack a reality. And the clue is in the title. A is artificial. So I sort of went on this little brain journey and was reflecting on this relationship I have to simplicity, and this relationship I have to humility, and trying to keep things simple and plain. And again, if I remind myself of the sort of the subheading of the blog that started the podcast, the Clear Out, the subheading on the blog was not wellness with attitude. The subheading was decluttering, clarifying, connecting. And that decluttering idea is about simplifying. It's about breaking things down into their constituent pieces to better understand them, to sort them, to categorize them, to better relate to them, and to basically drop down through the gears to be closer to them, to whatever, to appreciate, to evaluate, to identify, and then to see how that affects one's relationship to them. And the various things I've been doing over the last few years, teaching some martial arts, creating some wellness content, teaching mindfulness, advocating for wellness and well-being, advocating for being open, honest, transparent, authentic, vulnerable. They are all that. They're all sort of simplifying, decluttering. And there's unquestionably a relationship to that philosophy and over 30 years of martial arts practice and the karate training space, the dojo. That is an empty space. Just like the theatre is an empty space. And Peter Brook, the great British theatre practitioner, director, who passed away a couple of years ago, one of his core texts was a book called The Empty Space. And Peter Brook famously broke away from mainstream theatre at the height of his success, which he felt, theatre that is, he felt was just too moneyed and extravagant and commercial and ornate and moving further and further away from what theatre should be. And so he went back to basics and moved to Paris and established a very stripped back theatre company was it Bouffe de Nord? Was that the name of the company or the name of the location? But his company was made up of international actors, performers, and they just did this kind of stripped back version of theatrical storytelling and travelled around the world doing it. And I was lucky enough to see one or two of his shows, and yeah, they were a different experience, very pure, very direct, very simple, very unadorned, and very powerful, and very resonant. But his philosophy was, the empty space, that's all you need. Put someone in the empty space and let them do something in it, and then people will fill that space with what they feel, with what they respond to. And a dojo, a training hall, is very much like that, and these are sacred places. And so in a way, on some level, I can recognize that the karate dojo is a sort of church to me. It's a sacred place, and if it's not a place of worship, it's a place of practice. And certainly we can understand churches in that context. But a dojo is very much in the Protestant tradition, breaking away from the ostentatious wealth of Catholicism. I mean, the Protestant movement was all about going back to basics, stripping it down, being closer to, by the stripping away, getting closer to the pure connection with faith and God and practice. And that appeals to me, not from a religious point of view, but if you think of kind of the Lutheran, Quaker, maybe Presbyterian kind of traditions, there's an honesty in that and an austerity Now, of course, that could be, as depicted in, I don't know, maybe The Crucible, Arthur Miller's The Crucible, or as depicted in Lars von Trier's film Breaking the Waves. That can be depicted in very extreme, repressive, puritanical ways. And you think of the great friend of Ireland, Oliver Cromwell. Not really a great friend of Ireland, for clarification. Again, stripping things down to, a sort of a righteous viciousness, or a vicious righteousness, if you prefer. That's not what I'm talking about. But aesthetically, energetically, spatially, to strip things down, and the humility of that. I mean, dojos, karate training halls, and karate clubs, they are in theory, you step into that space and you put on the karate uniform, which is basically white pajamas, or famously described, I think, by Robert Twigger as angry white pajamas in his book about starting karate or continuing karate when he was an English teacher in Japan. It's always a funny way to think of them, angry white pajamas. But see, there's a simplicity to that uniform, and there's a collective humility. And the only thing that distinguishes one person from another in the dojo is the colour of your belt. Now, historically, when the old instructors, and I'm talking way, way back, before sort of karate got modernised and formalised by Gishin Funakoshi, who's the originator of the style of karate that I practice, Shotokan. Shoto was his pen name, Kan, so it's like Shoto's place. That's where people went to train. But even prior to him, when Gishin Funakoshi trained, he'd just go up to the master's house and request that he could train with them. And he'd just train in the garden or in the yard. And that one day the master would go, there you go, now you can begin your real journey, and you're given, and you'd be given your black belt. So it was white and then it was black. And really the colour system was a way of probably, I'm not sure, I again, I'm betraying how, it's what a bad student I am in terms of, knowing this. But the colour belt system really appeases Western students, because that's, it incentivizes the training towards the quick reward, because you can sort of acquire a new level if you're training regularly every few months. Here's a new colour, darker, 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 and eventually black. That's the idea. But apart from that, ultimately, when you go into a karate club to train, everyone's just there to do the training. So there's a collective spirit of humility. We're here to train. We're here to subject ourselves to the training, to serve the training, to serve the thing. And the thing is, in this case, karate, a martial art, which is an aesthetic ideal as much as it is a physical system of defensive and attacking techniques. It's an aesthetic ideal. So you're in service of that. And so if it's an ideal, it's not there. It's something that has to be physicalized or represented or infused with what you bring to it. And that's that idea of kind of bringing yourself to the space is very close to my philosophy in a lot of things I do. So even sitting down to do the podcast, as usual, as ever, mostly, I just have a couple of ideas in my head I want to talk about, and then I go. So all I'm doing is I'm bringing myself to the moment. I'm bringing myself to the space. And again, this is an idealized space. I mean, I can talk about my physical space here as I record, the room I sit in, the chair I sit in, the window I sit beside, the equipment I'm using. But I'm not really that mindful of that when I'm doing this. Really what I'm doing is I'm speaking into an empty space. I'm filling the space with my thoughts, my feelings, my reflections, my desire to represent those, and my desire to present them in a way that is graspable and attractive to those who might listen. My desire to connect with those who listen. That's you. Because if you're hearing this, you're listening. You might not be listening, you might just be hearing. But yeah, that's at the heart of this. And in a way, I feel like that's the antithesis of AI, because it's just a direct and visible, or in this case, audible, but tangible offer. And to stay with the karate metaphor or analog for the moment, we come to this idea of something that is honest. There's nothing more honest than a punch. There's nothing unambiguous. There's nothing ambiguous about a punch. So to train and to punch again and again and again, the physicalization of that effort, of that technique, it is a pure expression of effort, of desire, of intention. And it's very hard to disguise a lack of commitment. It's very hard to disguise a lack of energy. It's very hard to disguise a lack of fitness. It's very hard to disguise the absence of intention, because the body doesn't lie. And so there's tremendous honesty in putting a punch out there to be blocked or just to be practiced. And that's part of the appeal as well. And I mean, I think it's worth mentioning that it's not passive. Stepping into these spaces, it's not passive. And it requires mindfulness, and it can require compromise. It can require holding contradictory elements, because empty spaces, and particularly if you think about a theatrical space, but definitely if you think about a church, a religious space, a house of worship, a house of religious practice, you think of a dojo, a training hall, empty spaces, they can be filled with elements that aren't so great, and they can be filled with ego. And certainly theatrical spaces and church spaces and martial arts training spaces, they can be filled with ego. And it's an empty space. And if you get an ego big enough from the person who is calling the shots, that can be a very dominant flavour in a space that really is not meant to be about that. And that is something that has to be negotiated. And in a way, if you think of do you know the film Dodgeball? It's probably about 20 years old now. It's a very, very funny but quite ridiculous comedy with Ben Stiller and Vince Vaughn as competing managers of two very different styles of gym. And Vince Vaughn's gym is just full of people, for want of a better phrase, in the context of the movie, sort of losers and nerds and weeds and dweebs. But Vince Vaughn, it's like, it's all good. Just come here, get what you need to get out of this. See you later. This is our little family. And Ben Stiller is this kind of maniacally muscled up, steroid, damaged megalomaniac, who can only tolerate absolute apex alpha behavior in pursuing, physical perfection, and always the hard sell, always, hyper aggressive and hyperbolic and bombastic, and a total egomaniac. Everything is in his image and set up to serve his ego and his sense of self. I feel like I can picture, is there a portrait on the wall or a painting on the wall behind him in his office, the Ben Stiller character of him wrestling an enormously muscled horned bull, wrestling him to the ground. I think I'm remembering that correctly. But, you know, that can be, you know, a karate club can be like that. You know, as I've said before, these spaces can be, and theatre spaces as well, they can be absolutely subject to cults of personality. And when you get someone who believes that they are the last word on everything, it often leads to bad behaviour. It often leads to abuses of power. And we've come full circle, because that brings us back to Putin. If you're the last word, if you think you have the final say over everything, if you are the leader, you are the big personality in that empty space, and you dictate what's what. I mean, you're veering into Taming of the Shrew territory. I say it's night. I say the sun is shining when in fact the moon is high. And it's a total flex of ego, of narcissistic, narcissistic sort of delusion and craving absolute power and absolute influence. And it does not tolerate the presence of a critical voice. And those are toxic spaces. Now, I don't live in Russia. I don't live in Moscow. I don't live in Putin's head. I don't know how toxic those places are. But maybe some of the evidence, certainly as presented in the West, would lead us to come to that conclusion. Okay. I think that's all I've got today. I'm not sure if I had any other single solitary point to make, but we got through quite a bit. Yeah. So I want to give a shout out to someone who reached out to me across the seas of social media. I had a shout out from someone yesterday. I'm recording this on Tuesday. I had a shout out for someone who I hadn't heard from for a very long time, and initially I was like, who the hell is this? And then I was like, all right. So I want to say hey to Trev, who is a guy I knew back in the days when I was living in Wicklow Town, the early days of my marriage. And he was just a good head about the town, bit of a muso and a friendly face to bump into. And he just reached out. He's been living in different parts of the world. He's been in Italy for a long time and now finds himself in England. And he just reached out with a nice hello and said he'd been listening to the podcast and has been finding the podcast helpful to him. And it's just lovely. It's just lovely to get a message like that and go, all right, cool. Isn't that great? And so a nice opportunity to reconnect. And so there you go. So hi Trev, thanks for listening and thanks for reaching out with some good wishes and a nice message. I really appreciate it. And as they say in Australia, I hope you're travelling well, mate. So that's it. I am done for another week. I will be back next week with something different, and maybe I'll talk about those movies that I didn't get to talk about today. You can always throw me some love on social media if you dig what I do here, if you dig this gig. You can say nice things on YouTube, you can say nice things on Facebook, on Instagram. They're the main places. I've kind of given up on Twitter. I just don't really, I just don't value that space. There's just, every time I see a headline on Twitter, it's usually someone having a go at somebody else, or venting, or it's just bad energy. I don't like it. It does nothing for me. And I've underused it anyway. So, but yeah, those other spaces are just a bit more benign, a bit less toxic. And so if you want to say nice things, if you want to, you can, wherever you're listening to the podcast, Usually there's an opportunity to rate the show, to review the show. That stuff helps. Share, comment, whatever. And of course, if you're really motivated and think, this is doing a lot for me, or I want to get behind this independent production, this independent podcast, you can support it on Patreon or Patreon, whichever you prefer. Pronunciation wise, it's the same thing. Patreon.com/The Clear Out. And that might be a few euros a month, the price of a cup of coffee, the price of a cheap sandwich, depending where you live. And that's a lovely form of validation, and that all helps as well. Okay, that's it. I look forward to talking to you again next week. In the meantime, mind yourselves. Step into the space and think about what you're doing there. Think about what you're bringing to that space. Are you a balancing element? Are you the source of chaos? That might be appropriate. In that moment. But I don't think we're meant to stay in chaos, are we? I think it's better for us to kind of drop back down through the gears and stay calm. Okay, take care, mind yourselves. I'll talk to you next week. All the best. Bye.